All right, from Cairo to Cape Town, Lagos to Lamu, 54 nations, one continent, countless perspectives. Hi, my name is Waweru Njoroge.
I'm Okoh.
Welcome to Panel 54. This is the podcast where we unpack power, people, policy, and the paradoxes that define our time, with nuance, with history, and a deliberate commitment to context. This isn't punditry, it's perspective. It's not a briefing, it's a reframing, and it starts right here. So a lot of stories coming out from the continent and around the world. Probably one of the biggest ones, I think, for the continent was the Africa Climate Summit 2.0.
Yep.
I went to the first one that was held here in Kenya, KICC. Very, very impressive, actually. And it was on the back end of the Africa Energy Forum, which is also for the first time actually held in Africa. But here, I think the biggest story that's coming out of it was the inauguration of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam.
Yes.
GRD. The hydro project is huge, meant to be putting 40 gigawatts onto the grid, but there is controversy.
Of course there is. We're talking about ownership and, in terms of who benefits when it comes to countries of the Nile waters, Egypt coming into play, whereby they wanted at some point to have something of this sort. But with the command of a project this size, Ethiopia then gets the bragging rights, essentially for what they're able to provide, not just for their people, but folks who are downstream.
It's for the greater good then?
It's for the greater good of the region, and that's what it looks like. This is a project that is 14 years in the making and the development. And release of waters 3 years ago. You can imagine this huge infrastructure with the release of waters 3 years ago.
And I hope that conversation comes up when we have our guest in studio, Edgar Wamalwa,
yep,
in terms of the duration by which it takes from projects from inception to actual completion. And I have a feeling it might have to do, obviously, with basically policies and governance. But we'll find out whether Edgar will shed a light on that one.
It'll be fun, and hopefully that we don't see a situation where then we get into diplomatic tiff between Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia.
Yeah.
We can only cross our fingers and hope that this development is one that actually benefit the people.
Okay.
Yep.
Staying on the continent, something I did have a conversation with former president of Ghana, His Excellency John Kufuor, Galamsey.
Yes.
Galamsey is basically gold strip mining. I mean, illegal mining. More often than not, it's related to the Chinese, but they're not the only ones who are doing it. So this Newsweek report focused on the expulsion, actually, of a number of foreign nationals. And this is primarily from China, like I said. I'm not disparaging or saying anything disparagatory towards them. But environmentally, they're the ones who tend to be caught with their hands in the cookie jar. And this story basically underscores the complex challenges we as Africans basically face in managing our own natural resources. And natural resources, I think, is another conversation we're going to have with Edgar. Safeguarding
natural resources, and how you take care of them and what it can actually do for nations. So this was a big story, obviously, that came out. Then it says this was an incident in this big story. So this is a story that has many markers along the way. This is obviously not the first time this has been happening.
No, it's been happening.
I mean, it's been happening, So what guardrails are being put in place essentially to ensure that, this is reduced significantly? Big one coming out of Ghana.
Okay, what else do you have on your docket?
All right, so obviously state of security and things are going to bring things to Kenya where assassin-style shooting took place in Nairobi. And a prominent city lawyer was gunned down this week. And of course, there's several overtures here in terms of this, just 3 months shy of yet another incident where something like this happened with a member of parliament who was gunned down in a similar manner, not under the cover of darkness. Well, in that case it was, but for all to see in plain sight. It speaks to the issues around security and what's being done in a capital, and how seriously security agencies are going to take this.
That's the thing. I think the problem, and I'm sorry again if this comes across as in a manner that's not quite constructive for the conversation. And may his soul rest in peace. MPs and prominent people getting gunned down draws headlines.
Sure.
Common Mwananchi
every day,
dies for different reasons. Some of them through murder. It doesn't even make a blip. So I mean, it's. I suppose it's the nature of the way we are as a society, but the speed with which security forces will go to investigate and make sure everything has come to a close.
Yeah, very different.
Vis-a-vis that would happen if me and you it was to happen. Me and you.
We wouldn't be talking about it right now.
No, you're famous. It was like, yes, let's get and do justice. But yeah, so the security aspect obviously is there, but we also then look at the expediency in terms of how quickly we can actually get to the root of what happened.
Indeed.
Speculation is going to be rife about in terms of what and why it actually happened. But I think we'll avoid the aspect of speculation at this juncture, yeah.
Can we take that and move towards where another incident where a gentleman was shot and it was a fatal shooting in the US? Charlie Kirk, who was many would use the tag controversial, but he was far right wing in terms of his thoughts. He was also ironically pro gun use. And he was shot down at the point where he was answering a question about gun use and gun control in America. And it was also, many say, a friend of Donald Trump. But that's what we're looking at yesterday. That happened this week as well.
The irony is not lost on me. Now, if people have been following the ongoings with Gen Z in Kenya, held up against a mirror in Nepal, I think Gen Z have taken it to a whole different level altogether. 19 people unfortunately lost their souls, including the wife of the ex-prime minister of Nepal. But basically it has been rocked by violent protests, largely led by youth population, which is our Gen Z, or their Gen Z. But the unrest was initially sparked by a government ban on social media. Isn't that being... Okay, yeah, they banned social media, and then quickly evolved into a broader protest against corruption. So the headlines, the media carried it as protests against corruption. So I suppose the spark was the aspect of you're taking away a means for me to actually then report you.
Absolutely, to shine the light on the things that you're doing. And the journalists in us would want to come out and say, well, then what was happening under that layer, which is what saw then the eventual resigning of the prime minister who said, you know what? Okay, hang on. So was it that we did not want a spotlight on him in terms of what was happening? But by that time, the people were fed up. And that's why we saw burning of media houses. We saw burning of parliament. We saw so many things dragging, minister through the streets and, disrobing him. Yeah. And, then he ended up in a body of water. The people have been fed up because of true, call it social media use, but at the end of the day, social media was a means to an end. Social media is
a way you can vent. I have a problem with the government of the day or whatever the case may be, or even
I have a problem with the corruption. That's what I'm going to say.
I wouldn't go as far as maybe naming the government per se, but I have a problem with the product. Yeah, I can put them name and shame, and people then. But then this actually caused a prime minister to step down and resign.
Yes,
I was looking at it from the context of the African continent.
Who's going to step up and resign?
That's my point. Would you ever see anybody?
The thing is burning down. Who's resigning?
That's my no. Yeah. Would you ever see an African politician or leader say, "Okay, fine, I understand and I can feel the people's pain.
Let me step aside."
Yeah,
be a cold day in hell.
Yeah, Spider-Man in the multiverse. It's a whole different kettle of fish, to be honest.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So I guess last story that we look at: Giorgio Armani.
Oh yeah.
Passed at the age of 91.
Sole proprietor of a $1 billion industry.
And I
what do you own? What do you own that's Giorgio Armani?
What do I own that's Giorgio Armani? Probably a bottle of fragrance.
Really?
Yes.
I have the local version. Yeah, Njoroge Kimani.
I think about Giorgio Armani, I think about what it does for the continent, and my mind goes to the Lissapur.
Yeah, I was going to say, I didn't realize there's such influence. He influenced,
big time. So the Lissapur, of course, in DR Congo, specifically right in the capital, it's just that young men and women dress up in designer clothing. It doesn't matter where you live, but they dress up in this designer clothing, make sure they're dressed to the nines, they smell impeccable, they're dressed immaculately, and they pay homage to the designers. Giorgio Armani was one of them.
Fair enough.
So I guess that was a Lissapur paying homage to Armani.
Well, may his soul rest in peace as well.
From cobalt mines in Congo to cocoa farms in Ghana, Africa fuels the world. But the wealth that leaves Africa's shores doesn't always come back home.
Over the past 2 decades, Africa's external debt has tripled now, now topping $1.1 trillion, with China emerging as the largest bilateral creditor. Kenya's own public debt actually stands at 12 trillion shillings as of May 2025, which translates to about $93 billion.
The same countries that supply the oil, gold, cobalt, and cocoa that power global industries also carry some of the heaviest debt burdens and some of the deepest poverty.
It's a story about power and dependency of highways and harbors, and it speaks as much about geopolitics as they do about progress. Some call it partnership, others call it a trap.
But it isn't just about debt. It's about why Africa still lags behind despite its plenty, and whether ideas like Africapitalism can offer a way out.
Well, here to help us unpack this conversation, we're joined by Edgar Wamalwa, who is a strategic consultant and project finance subject matter expert.
Edgar, welcome to Panel 54.
Thank you for having me.
Right, let's start with the question. What is a strategic consultant and project finance subject matter expert?
Two of those people.
Yes.
Simply put, it is the culmination of 32 years in investment banking, initially 14 years in South Africa, spent 5 years and change with United Bank of Switzerland. I then returned home in 2009. I did stints with Chase Bank. My last tour of duty in banking was at Barclays, now ABSA, where I ran the public sector desk. I pivoted out of banking into consulting, specifically at KPMG, where I spent 2 years from 2023 to this year in March. And my specific role was project financing for infrastructure projects across the East Africa region.
Okay.
So this is you.
Oh, yes, it is. Well, that now helps us understand what a strategic consultant and project finance subject matter expert is.
Exactly.
We're going to get a lot of information from you today. So basically, Africa does supply cobalt that powers global EVs, and this whole new fad about green economies and greenhouse gas emissions reductions and things like that. And if you've been through any duty-free, a lot of people say, bring me Swiss chocolates. And that obviously comes from cocoa that is made here, right? And the oil that runs the world's economies is basically mined from Africa as well. Yet the paradox of plenty still remains. We have a lot, but we don't seem to have... It's not that we don't have enough. We seem to have nothing left in the coffers once we've done all that. To put this in context, the DRC supplies most of the world's cobalt and copper, yet 73% of its people are living below $2.15 per day. So the question becomes this: why does Africa remain poor despite being resource rich? And more importantly, as a follow-up to that question, is it purely failed leadership, or is the global system basically against us?
Interesting question. Allow me to provide you with some data to provide context as we begin to unpack. The Economic Commission for Africa, United Nations body headquartered in Ethiopia, regularly produces data on the African continent. In aggregate, Africa's GDP is about 2.8 trillion US dollars. The flip side of that is that the estimate in terms of an X factor is including, assuming the monetization of all our resources, oil, coltan, and the other elements that you've mentioned, suggests that our aggregate GDP would be in the region of about 24 trillion. So several factors X of where we currently are at. What informs the dismal performance, if you will? In my opinion, underinvestment in critical mineral resources that catalyze growth. Number two, frankly speaking, a lack of a big picture macroeconomic plan at the continental level and unpacking that at the sovereign level. I'll refer you to China, which is a fantastic use case in this example. They've got the Silk Road Initiative, which they rolled out very aggressively from 2030. And its purpose was to use infrastructure investment as a catalyzer to drive trade and power economic growth from a China perspective. Where are we today? Resoundingly successful from a China sovereign perspective.
Yeah.
So when we look at issues around the continent, and we look at flows of resources from a lot of the time where many nations gained flag independence and resources started to flow out of the continent. If today we were to look into a situation where certain countries who provide these resources, DR Congo, Kenya, Nigeria, looking around, if we saw that they would, Ghana with its gold, the diamonds coming out of the southern part of Africa, if we saw that these nations decided to close their doors for the next 5 years, what would happen in that situation? Would the world stop and take notice? Or would Africa itself be able to handle the great demand on sorting out its economies?
Interesting question. Assuming closed door without the ability to self-monetize significant resource deposits, my sense it would be, in the first instance, inflationary. Secondly, there would be a pause process globally because there's no substitution factor. Allow me to expound. Coltan from the DRC that powers all our devices. 70% of the deposit resource is in the DRC. And it's a depleting resource, which is a beauty about all natural resources, as it were. If you assume a scenario where there's no commercial activity to monetize, 70% of global resource availability, the 30 that is being monetized very quickly runs out. There's no plan B.
Right. So we African nations don't have, I want to call them protectionist policies, not in the case of providing that protection for its people, but also setting up infrastructure that allows you to essentially control the game. Is that what we're saying?
That's what we're saying. Let me present a scenario. It is irrefutable that during the third industrial revolution, Europe and America catalyzed their growth off the back of the exploitation of oil and gas, specifically. Fast forward to the current day, we've got climate considerations that essentially impact negatively Africa's ability to monetize that same catalyzer of growth that propelled Europe and America and China and Asia to where they're at today, to our detriment. Allow me to hone in and bring it home to Kenya, actually East Africa. We are a net importer across the board. What is our most significant import item? Month on month?
Disappointment.
Month on month, it is oil. Kenya specifically spends no less than, depending on the value of the shilling to the dollar, spends no less than $500 million a month importing crude product. Whilst we have in the ground unmonetized oil and gas resources. Allow me to segue slightly. One of the transactions, flagship transaction that I worked on at KPMG was the construction of the oil pipeline from Kabale in Uganda to the port of Tanga in Tanzania. Long story short, its purpose is to evacuate crude product out of the ground in Uganda for export through the Tanga port in Tanzania. What does this all mean? Uganda becomes an oil-producing country in 2027. What are the net benefits from a Uganda sovereign perspective? Their import bill for petroleum through, courtesy of Kenya, is averagely between 200 and 300 million US dollars a month. 2027, that tap gets turned off and they're self-sufficient. The benefits, commercial and social, are infinitesimal. Again, need to have a plan that is sovereign-centric, Africa-centric, and in our best interest, as opposed to what has happened thus far, where our strategy and policy is crafted on our behalf by the likes of the IMF and the World Bank.
It's being spoon-fed to us.
Right, but then why? This is the thing. Because we understand the need to be able to be self-sufficient. I think to an extent, a lot of African countries understand the need, that it will propel you to another level of economic development not experienced on the continent yet. However, we fail to do this on a regular. I'll give you examples. Nigeria had 3 oil refineries in the 80s. In the 80s, we were refining our own oil. But then after that, the refineries broke down. The running joke at the time was that Nigeria ate everything plus the goose. So what happens, excuse me, in that situation whereby we're unable to maintain the infrastructure? Ghana recently said that they were going to stop sales of cocoa outside of Ghana, that they wanted to introspect and build industry. You can't do that while you stop the sale.
Correct.
How do we maintain and develop our own infrastructure to allow these things to happen?
Without having to
borrow. The question is, are you ready without having to borrow?
But also without having to borrow, I mean...
Are you ready? And many would say that African countries, we can say it, but we're not ready. African countries are not actually ready to take on the responsibility that we are saying give to us.
Sure. My response is that strategically we are misguided and misdirected. Allow me to, again, bring it home to Kenya and give you some real-life examples. The pool of pension fund capital in Kenya is close to 2 trillion shillings. 2 trillion shillings. And the beauty about pension capital, that pool gets replenished, actually gets added on to month on month, year on year, right? That becomes a basis, a framework, subject to the right legal and legislative frameworks that you can utilize for project finance and infrastructure development, assuming we have the institutions and good governance structures to drive it. I'll pose a question, and again, it is informed by what I see as a policy of begging bowl syndrome across the continent. Did China was China a recipient of a Marshall Plan? No. Was Singapore a recipient of a Marshall Plan? No. Pockets across Asia, you recall, I believe it was the mid to late 90s, the Asian tigers growing a clipper, a double-digit growth sustained for a long period of time. Those, what manifests and what is visible is the result of work put in and strategic decisions put in to drive and catalyze growth over a period of time. It doesn't happen overnight, but the journey of 1,000 steps starts with the first one, and you need, of necessity, to pull back, look at all the arrows in your quiver, as it were. Kenya example again, oil resources, gold, and other rare mineral reserves, unmonetized.
Being myopic, not looking at the bigger picture. Sorry, I want to bring in the aspect.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, I want to bring in the aspect of Africapitalism. Right? I don't know how much of a buzzword really it is, and how many people actually fully understand it. But it was coined by Tony Elumelu. Yes, that's the guy. Yeah. And the idea is that African entrepreneurs, and private capital, this tends to be what drives a lot of economies, can transform the continent by investing in both profit and shared prosperity, right? It's based on 5 basic pillars, right? One of the pillars is private sector leadership. The next one is long-term investment, value-added growth, inclusive development, and the development dividend. Is it actually realistic? Is it realistic for African continent in terms of, can it break us free from debt, right? Can it break us free from debt? And the other question, is it more philosophical rather, than an actual roadmap that we can use?
Thematically, I'm aligned to the possibility of Africapitalism being a catalyzer for sustainable growth on the continent. That said, unpacking it, there are elements that are unavoidable and need to be in place to drive it forward. I'll give you certain examples. South Africa have made significant headway in that respect. Again, it is known that African sovereigns across the continent have fiscal challenges, right? That's consistent. Kenya, just under 70% debt to GDP. There's minimal headroom to drive anything forward. South Africa purposed to empower and enhance very specific financial institutions whose mandate it is to this day to drive infrastructure and economic growth. There's the IDC, Industrial Development Corporation. Then there's the PIC. PIC is actually South Africa's equivalent of the NSSF here. Fundamentally differently resourced. In the time that I spent, the 14 years that I spent in South Africa, the PIC was one of the most aggressive competitors to the investment banking industry, literally going out and poaching top talent and putting them in positions to drive the agenda. Where's PIC? PIC today makes investments as far-flung as Kenya. It's invested in Kenya, for example. And certainly probably in Nigeria as well. I'm just giving you a sense. So private sector led, it then requires the thought and need to begin to build institutions of that nature, because what are you then looking to do? You need a framework in which capital is happy enough to be corralled into to then be deployed.
So then what do you do? Excuse me. What do you do? Because here we are, it is clear, it's evident that there are private organizations, companies around the continent that are flourishing. Again, I go and I give the example of Nigeria, whereby in the 80s and towards the 90s, 3 of the major refineries then shut down. Because they couldn't. Come along, Dangote, who 2-3 years ago,
$20 billion
$20 billion investment in a refinery that will finally then see Nigeria refining its own oil.
And are there cartels that are making money by them not actually being able to do it in the first place?
Of course.
So that was the reason.
We look at the idea whereby it's as old as the slave trade, is it not?
Yes.
Whereby it's the same thing. You must have a local facilitator, even for these things that we are saying are not working. If we have flows of resources outside of the continent, if we have somebody benefiting from Nigeria not refining its own oil, it is not just external, it's internal as well.
So we're sabotaging, we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
So why can we do it so well in the private sector? Tony Elumelu, another example. Dangote, another example, whereby in the private sector, they flourish. These are the same individuals that are made up of the stock of the society. They don't bring in Martians to do this.
But as you think about that, there's something else before I lose this train of thought.
Sure.
And you said the aspect of leadership, and I know in this country, and I can't pull back like you did. At one point, I think the leadership did say, okay, fine, we are going to take, when you said taking the best, so we looked at an aspect where we said, we're going to take technocrats and put those technocrats in positions of PSs and CSs.
Right.
Because they have the vision. That, I wouldn't say failed, but it had its own obstacles because they were inheriting systems that are broken. So it doesn't matter if you so if I could take the best of the best and put them into a position where they could lead and try and push the agenda we want to have. Do we then just say, you know what, you guys as private sector, stick to what you're doing, because the politicians are not going to, if you make them politicians, it doesn't help anybody. Let's keep relying heavily on the private sector to keep driving the agenda, which is, I mean, it seems to be working right now, but there's only so much they can actually do. So sorry, there's 2 questions there.
So I think it goes without saying that if we were a patient, we are in HDU. Not ICU,
circling the drain,
but HDU,
not yet.
Right? Yeah. The solution to move things forward is not to say, well, system broken, so we'll just limp along, and you do you, I'll do me, and we'll see where we land. No, this is why I circle back to the statement about the need to have a cohesive, coherent plan. What's the plan? And properly executed, you envisage you'll be at 10x down the road.
Properly executed. You then begin to build and put in the enablers. First things first, lessons from my consulting years. Baseline assessment. Do a baseline. It'll tell you what's working, what's not working, and if it's good enough, it'll tell you what the issues are, and you can then course correct,
seek guide precisely.
And
then you plow in on that basis. I mean, it's mantra, it's commonplace in the private sector. We need, again, for this HDU patient, we need this like yesterday. I'll circle back to the oil sector. Interesting, right? And again, for me, whilst I'm conscious, cognizant of the needs to protect the environment and all of that, to a large extent, I fundamentally believe and argue that it is Africa's time to monetize its natural resource, which is a catalyzer for sustained double-digit growth. What is that? Oil and gas. Now, you don't do it. Again, I worked on the Uganda-Tanzania project. Interestingly enough, Uganda proved the commercial viability of their resources of oil after Kenya.
Yes, yeah.
Right? Fast forward to today, Kenya is lost in the woods. Uganda, our neighbor, is going to become an oil-producing country
in 2 years.
In 2 years. Now, is that the most efficient construct for monetizing that asset? Because on a standalone basis, let me pull back. Can Uganda, Tanzania have both oil and gas reserves that are significant in aggregate? When you break it down, the commercial viability is harder to prove.
Yeah.
What I'm suggesting, if there was a plan crafted around the three sovereigns collectively agreeing to monetize their oil and gas resources, transformation. We'd be saving, post-commissioning of that plant wherever it is, we'd be saving billions of dollars.
I come back in
imports every year.
I come
and
back
then you'll
to
be operating in a surplus, which is what is necessary for anybody to develop.
Yes,
absolutely. And I've not even touched on the supply chain, the ecosystem. Good Lord.
I come back to what's in it for me.
Yeah.
So let me take you, if it's just so we can, it's by way of comparison. And when you talk about a plan necessary for this to happen, I liken it to what Ronald Reagan did in, the late 80s with Reaganomics. It wasn't just an idea that he, suggested to the American people. By the time he made this announcement, it was that there was a plan, and that it was that off of the back of what it was clear in the American economy, that it was the people and their businesses that would be the drivers of the economy. Absolutely. What they made sure they did was to set up the infrastructure that made it conducive for these businesses to thrive. And the businesses that we look at today that hold the American economy were built in that time
frame.
Because the environment was
enabling
made
environment
at that time.
Absolutely.
And they're the ones for whose economies are bigger than some African countries today. Businesses, one business, bigger than an entire African nation and its neighbors combined. So we can see that when now Waweru asks, what's in it for me? It's capitalist. It's make the buck regardless of what you do. Because in order for us to be seen as one of the big boys, we have to be operating in surplus. African nations, unfortunately, for the major part of it, are not operating. Talk less of operating in surplus. We're not operating. Should we get to the place where we have to produce? We cannot say that nations who have resources are producing. It's in the ground. It's in the ground. You're not doing anything with it, man. Sure. It's coming out of the ground, or you're selling flowers, or you're selling coffee. It's in the ground. But if you're not producing, if we're not adding value to the product and selling it for a profit, we will not develop. We won't.
Sure.
So how do we get from that place? Because you can't tell me we don't know.
No, sure. So I'll circle back to regulations and legislation around minerals. I'll reference South Africa. South Africa, after independence in about 2004, instituted a new policy, right? Against which Kenya's policy is actually framed. There's a separation of ownership of resource vis-a-vis ownership of land. The government is the owner and custodian of all resources in Kenya and in South Africa on behalf of the people of that particular sovereign. South Africa goes a step further and says they give you a finite timeline threshold.
Okay.
So between 5 or 10 years, within which you have to monetize it. Use it or lose it. If you don't, see you buy.
There's an incentive right there.
Oh, yeah.
That's an incentive right there. I'm told our minerals legislation is similarly framed. We do Do we apply to the letter of the law? I would suggest no. And so therefore we go back to, just doing the right thing.
Who controls it though? And is it African nations who are controlling these things? Or is there some kind of external puppet master at play?
It's African nations because now a deviation in Tanzania and Kenya, we have a local component, local ownership in Kenya. It's 35%. Any company registered that desires to monetize natural extractives needs minimum representation local 35%. I think that's where the wheels fall off. In Tanzania, if you recall, the 90s, shortly after they commercially achieved commercial viability, proved commercial viability of their gold, the South African big ticket mining companies all crossed the border precisely. Went well for a while, but then the legislation became draconian, where literally it was a free carry. And it still exists today. I think free carry, free ownership to locals to the tune of between 20 and 30%, which then became unpalatable. It dilutes the commercial proposition. What I'm suggesting to you is that, there are ways, and again, it starts with a baseline assessment. What we need to do, really, literally, and it's urgent. HDU, baseline. What's working, what's not working, how do we fix, and where do we want to go? And in the context of a rapidly changing global economic environment, which levers are we best placed to focus on and press play on? We do that very poorly.
Before we dive into that global perspective, actually, from an African lens, just very quickly, while I said I do tend to be a bit cynical, what are we actually getting right? We're talking about, I am actually asking in the sense that, yes, we've said that Africa lags behind, but what are we, what can we pat ourselves on?
Our tech space, tremendous.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that goes without saying. Our banking sector, because what I do is regularly I provide a lens, comparative lens across the Greater East Africa region from a financial institution perspective, that we've got very right. I believe the recent requirement, legislation to increase the core capital for all the banks from $1 billion to $10 billion is transformational. Transformational, because we're now building institutions with robust ability to begin to self-finance all of these infra projects that we aspire to roll out. It's transformational. Yeah.
Actually, because
and to just unpack that, it's important because the current capital adequacy for a bank is $1 billion shillings. The extent to which I can maximally lend to Ndu is 25% of that only, right? And then I'm full house. It's a different proposition when I take that figure from $1 billion shillings to 10 billion.
10 billion.
I mean, now we're talking, right? And then you've got like 40 odd banks.
Right, who can do this?
And it then requires a different. They need to get creative.
Yeah, because when you hit the debt, then you're going to have a.
I mean, yeah.
So
what lessons should Africa, not necessarily us as Kenyans, but Africa policymakers, right? What kind of lessons do we need to then put in place when balancing the aspect of courting global partnership and local interest?
Sure. Again, I like to use real life examples, and I'll reference my experience from both the bank and the consulting world, where we literally sat in the middle. You're advising government and private sector, trying to get a deal across the line. The one frustration, the one weakness in virtually all the conversations around transactions that I was involved in was the fact that the technical teams from the government side were filled with loyalists who are not necessarily subject matter experts.
Okay.
Now, when you have a construct of that nature, what should typically take 12 months will take you 36 if you're lucky. If you're lucky. So, we've got all the enablers. And again, it's a policy decision to bring your best and brightest. Because, at the end of the day, an administration, the benchmark when you exit office is pipeline driven. How many projects are attributable to you? If you then shoot yourself in the head, not even the foot, by bringing people who have limited or no understanding,
then you have a problem.
the wheels fall off.
The policies of you scratch my back, I scratch yours, and you're not actually looking at the best interest of the people you rule over.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you look at regional bodies, we have the AU. I can already see you shaking your head.
He winced at that.
Oh, I know. It was a bit painful to hear it. But if we look at what it is vis-a-vis what it was meant to be when Muammar Gaddafi had this idea of the Organization of African Union, perhaps it pales in comparison to his vision then. But if we look at what it does today and what it's hopeful that it will do in the future, what would you advise the AU does in terms of advising African countries? Go the China way, pivot towards Washington, or gamble on Africa first?
So, a few months ago, I pondered on why this AU thing isn't working. And my simple take is that it's too large. And it's too fractured, because you've got fractured from an Africanization catalytic driver perspective. You've got West, North, East, SADC and all of that, all who have very different agendas, I think. But to answer the question, what will be useful is to, again, take a step back, let the African Union be the African Union. And one of my very fundamental specific challenges with the AU is, if you went down the list of all the countries, more than half are not paid up.
This is true.
So what are we doing?
Yeah.
Right, in the first instance. If you look at East Africa, with the exception of maybe one or two, they're probably all fully paid up, the East African community, whatever it used to be called. My strong suggestion, again, informed by, allow me to segue, what I learned about how best to roll out integrated infrastructure projects. For example, infrastructure is all-encompassing, and it should be big picturesque. From assuming the airport, people fly in, how they then get interconnected, be it commuter rail into the CBD or whichever, it's all interconnected. And it's not, you can't solution on a sovereign basis only. It has to speak to.
It's being concept.
Precisely. That's how it's most latent and most powerful. In an EAC context, we have alignment of purpose to then work collectively to build an integrated oil and gas play, for example. It then begins to make sense. And it's bite-sized in terms of ability to arrange the requisite project finance to monetize it.
So, for example, we complain a lot about if you're going to fly from Lagos to Lamu.
See what you did there?
Thanks. That it's extremely expensive. It's cheaper to fly to Dubai or London and then come back into the African continent.
Absolutely.
So what we're saying is, if you can go from Nairobi to Dar es Salaam or to Uganda at the same cost that it would get you to go from Paris to Stockholm, for example, €150. If you could do that in those blocks, it is only that with a united front that you can start to say, well, okay, let's get bigger. Let's go now to East and Southern.
Correct.
And then from there, let's include Central and then include West. We can't do that as a whole and have the AU stand on a podium and say, okay, everybody, let's see how we can have the flights between countries reduced.
The turnaround time, I think, in my opinion, humbly, longer. AU and NEPAD. NEPAD's been around for, again, you're as good as your track record. What is the what are the delivery credentials on a project basis of an AU, for example?
Right.
Food for thought, actually.
Indeed. A lot of food for thought.
Okay. Edgar, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Panel 54. We were looking at the aspect of why Africa is lagging behind. It's not all doom and gloom, though.
No.
Although a lot of it is a very heavy conversation to that, but you've given us some solutions at least.
Indeed.
Some kind of light at the end of the tunnel. So thank you very much for joining us.
Plus there's a plan. There must be a plan.
That's the thing. Not making decisions, or rather making decisions and actually following through, not just in the name.
Not scattergunning.
Yes, exactly.
There you go.
All right. Well, that's it for this episode of Panel 54, where we rethink the world one African perspective at a time. If today's conversation made you pause, reflect, or even reframe, do remember to share it and start the conversation. Don't forget to tag us in as well. You can find us on your favorite social media platforms or on our social media handle at Panel54Pod. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember to keep the lens clean.